So, I would like to welcome Dr. Jim Harries to our department seminar. I'll give a brief introduction, and then Jim is going to talk us through his topic today, tackling envy and witchcraft biblically, the difference between the West and Africa. Jim, if I can call you Jim, received his PhD in theology from the University of Birmingham, but he has been in missionary service since 1987 and has taught Bible oriented to indigenous churches using the Luo and Swahili languages in Kenya and Tanzania. And Jim chairs the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission and is an adjunct faculty at the William Carey Institutional University in the USA, and has published over 50 peer-reviewed articles and also books on the subjects as diverse as
witchcraft and envy.
all on witchcraft. No doubt missionary and the experience of missionary service in East Africa. Today, Jim is going to explain how he came to live in an African village, interacting entirely using African languages from 93 to date. He will then give the contrary views to some common criticisms of grassroots involvement of European people in Black Africa. Jim draws on almost daily interaction with indigenous churches in Western Kenya for 31 years, while pointing to impediments arising from the uses of the English language in Africa, and particularly regarding the existence of and how to counter witchcraft and envy in these spaces.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. There's books here, if anyone wants books. I don't want to carry them back to Kenya. So, title, Tackling Envy and Witchcraft Biblically, Differences Between the West and Africa. That's really the details of where we are. But just to give you an idea of some of the churches I've worked with for a long time. Now, of course, what's interesting is when they are so active and noisy. So they happen to be videos of much the same thing. I think there are parallels with Zionist churches here. Actually, on Sunday, I joined Marcus at a church in a township, and it was amazing. It was almost a photocopy of what we do in Kenya. So that's my part of my outreach missionary work, if you like. So to talk a little bit about myself, called for life in 1987. A lot of people in those days were looking for an experience in the third world. To me, that's trying out God, if you like. But if you have a bad experience, so before God, I committed myself for life rather than for a temporary period. I went to Zambia to teach agriculture at a secondary school, and that gave me then a context in which to try and to learn the things that I thought one ought to do if one arrives in a poor community. And very soon, well, certainly by the end of 3 years, concluded that the people were troubled by witchcraft such that my agricultural knowledge really isn't what they were looking for, isn't what's really going to help them. The bottleneck was elsewhere. So that was part of my then moving from agriculture into God's Word, because it seemed clear to me that it was God's Word that addressed the arena in which witchcraft occurs. I was also convicted by my experience there. It so happens that when I went to Zambia, they put me living with a Zambian fellow. I was a single and I remain single and celibate. Why we so often live distinct lives. The impression I'd had from UK was that missionaries and Africans work together like this, but there were differences and tensions and so forth. So I set out to live closely with the people, which I've then done in Kenya rather than continuing to do it in Zambia. I did missionary training school, and the dominant thinking, as I see it from the West, is you have the intelligence, you have the money, you can help those people, you'll make a big splash. But that has many problems if you have a lot of power before you understand what you're doing. So I somewhat rebelled against that. Kenya, going there was alone. I didn't have a support network. there was one fellow I knew, and I landed in his village. Now that has brought the amazing benefit that I'm rooted in a village and not in a mission station, or in a white community somewhere, if you like, and that continues to be the case. YTC, Yala Theological Center. People very interested in what I wanted to do, so we set up this extension Bible teaching program. I mean, it's just the honest situation. My colleagues were anticipating that I would invest money into this, so they're very keen to be a part of it. And when I didn't put money in, this was their frustration, frankly. Almost every meeting, it was about how to get money out of Jim. And I did compromise on that a little by giving a stipend from the Bible college I was also teaching at the same time. So I began to be involved with African independent or indigenous churches. Our director was a member of a Rojo church, the ilk of which you've just seen, and have continued that. I think in those indigenous churches you can get a doorway onto truth, more so than in those who are imitating the mission churches and oriented perhaps more for money and convincing the West that they're legit so as to get relationship and so forth. In the last 12 years, my office, as I call it, is on a Coptic Orthodox mission compound. So I'm not Coptic or Orthodox, but I do have that close relationship with them also. That's Egyptian church, obviously. I'm absolutely privileged to be able to rear orphan children from 1997 to date. So my home, I rent, let's say it's a typical village home. Doesn't mean it has to have a grass thatch roof, by the way. But there I've looked after up to 12 orphan children. And of course what that does is if you go home and you use Luo and Swahili at home, then it helps you to get a grasp on those languages. And our home language is not English, it's the Luo, which is the tribal tongue, in Swahili, which obviously is the regional language. I've engaged in a lot of scholarship for various reasons, particularly perceiving the desperate need for there to be better understanding outside of Africa of what is going on, because the West has an enormous amount of power and control and seems often not really to have much of a clue what's happening. So I've set about trying to inform people of that and specifically encourage some missionaries to engage their service or their key service or ministry using local languages and local resources. And that then as a means to access what's going on in the community so as to be able to address it. I don't like using English looking at these African issues because it just puts you way off target, and it doesn't surprise me in many ways that once the financial incentives are gone that it's hard to agree with one another, because it may be so-called English the same, but the way in which English is rooted can be vastly different. So there are footnotes in the Word document, they're not on the PowerPoint presentation. I'll also say I'm grateful to Marcus, who's sitting here with me, who's hosted me in Cape Town. We work very closely and on many issues over the years. It's my first time to visit him here, and that's been a privilege, so glad he's been able to come along and catch up with what's happening. So I consider witchcraft to be the effect of ill feeling of one person on another. Sangomas take advantage of people's fear of witchcraft to facilitate peaceful relations in communities at the cost of focused killings and ostracism, suspicion and widespread confirmation of implicit beliefs that one's problems are caused by others. Now, I've already said this, major emphasis on my scholarly work is advocating some Western missionaries and or development workers engage their ministry with African people using entirely indigenous languages and resources in ministry. We call this vulnerable mission. So if there's a thread that runs through my scholarly work, then this is probably it. Now, for the purpose of this seminar, I'm drawn René Girard, and I just ask here whether he's known. If he's known to you, some of this will be recapitulation. But initially, frankly, I didn't want to, but it does give a theoretical foundation then on which I'm drawing. One doesn't have to agree with him entirely, but I think he's a scholar who I found who is is the closest to enabling articulation of what's happening in Africa today that I'm seeing. So it's a theoretical basis I've come across. I want to articulate some of his thesis. I've written some articles on this. For example, now for those who didn't know, he's a Frenchman, became an immortal, i.e. recognized by the academia in France as one of the 40 top academics of his time, a Catholic and long at Stanford University. He realized people desire what others have. Now, desire, envy, mimetic desire is a term that he likes to use, but we're very close to envy here already. Even more than that, they desire what other people desire. It's widely known in the advertising world, of course, people want things that others have, and envy, there you go. Some things are reproducible. Food, if you plan well, maybe there's enough, everyone has it. But some things cannot be reproducible, like women is an example that Girard draws on, of limited supply. So men can fight and struggle over women. And he makes this kind of point, if you're a schoolboy, which girl are you interested in? Well, quite likely the one all the other boys are interested in. And if there's a girl the other boys are avoiding, you think there must be something wrong with her. You desire what other people desire. You desire their desire. And even having an instance where if you're not sure, you ask your friend who to marry, which puts you into competition with the person advising you. So the person who you're imitating prevents you fulfilling your desire. In the classic case, of course, if he marries this girl, then I can't marry her. But an example here again, if you really want to be the professor, then the professor becomes the person obstructing your progress. This is all kind of drawing on Girard. I read him some time ago. This is a kind of Jim's regurgitated view of Girard, but I think you'll recognize it anyway. If someone is standing between you and the object of your desire, then clearly getting rid of the person will satisfy your desire. We see now witchcraft coming onto the scene. In human community, a variety of people stand between us and our achievement of what we want. This renders people you're with to in some ways be your adversaries. Presence of such adversarial relationships resulted in ancient humans, according to Girard, in human community constantly being characterized by widespread, almost indiscriminate enmity and killing. Now those familiar with Girard will realize that's kind of his primordial humankind. So he's not an evolutionist in the biological sense, but he reckons that the discovery of sacrifice was the beginning of civilization and enabled people to stop focusing primarily on killing each other. Discovery of the scapegoat, beginning of religion or civilization. That's what I refer to as focused killing. Instead of, I want to kill everybody in this room, we'll find someone who just seems the kind of person we don't like, and the rest of us will gang up on them and get rid of them. Or chase them away, of course. People discovered finding a scapegoat could be a means to restoring peace to a community by enabling people to focus their general interhuman enmity onto one person, group, or even animal. The existence of such focus meant that killing or chasing this person resulted in peace descending on a community. This mechanism we could call the scapegoat mechanism is very widespread amongst human communities. So in an office. Now thankfully I don't know how things work around here, but often there's someone you kind of conclude isn't really desirable and they're quietly pushed out. Jews have been scapegoats in Europe for centuries, and again Girard points much at that. In the book of Genesis 37 to 50 we have Joseph, whose brothers decide he's not really desirable because he keeps telling their father about their misdemeanors, and they get rid of him. Interesting things happen subsequently. The far right is cancelled as it's responsible for today's plight. So xenophobia, I'm not South African, but there is a very deep reaction. My problems are caused by somebody, and I want to find somebody to victimize, and then I'll feel better. So, which is chased away or is killed. The peace that descends on a community once a presumed culprit is removed seems to demonstrate they were indeed guilty of witchcraft. Thus natural tensions within the community can be resolved by occasional witch accusations and disposals. The unity that arises from this kind of identification of a common enemy is a mechanism that enables or even forces the gathering of people when witchcraft is suspected, i.e. when a victim is being sought. The equivalent in the Christian church today is people being attracted by the cross. Now, I won't expound now, otherwise I'll end up repeating myself too much. So the Bible is replete with accounts of victimization. Joseph, already mentioned, by his brothers. Saul wants to kill David. Prophet Amos, disliked. Prophets generally disliked. So Gerard tells us, all other ancient texts declare victims guilty and rejoice over their demise. The Bible takes the side of the victim. The Bible also condemns the witchcraft cycle of bloodletting by outlawing envy. Hence the 10th commandment, cover not your neighbour's property, whether it be his god donkey, his house, his wife, whatever, which seems to sum up earlier commands in the Decalogue. One is not going to commit adultery or murder or give false testimony unless one is envious of what someone else has. Substitutionary rituals that focus on people's minds onto gruesome death without the actual killing of a witch are widespread in human history. So horror movies, I don't like horror movies, but people do. Coming back from the movie, they feel a bit better about themselves because at least it's not that bad where they are. Sacrifice of domestic animals that are like family members. That Israel was practicing in the temple up to and beyond the time of Jesus by divine command, the book of Leviticus. Despite Isaiah's revelation, 1 verse 11, there must have been a source of deep and what did I put there? Tension in Israel. So there we have Isaiah 1:11. The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me? Says the Lord. I have more than enough of burnt offerings, of rams, and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. Shock, horror, because this is what enabled us to thrive. Now, himself, according to Isaiah, is saying he doesn't like that. So, New Testament then brings us the solution to this thing that defeated the Jews up till then. Jesus, in a way, took us back. Ancient myths articulate how a sacrificed person becomes a god. And this is, Gerard, if peace results from the demise of the supposed witch, people surmise that he was a witch indeed. I had singular powers, so could in some cases be considered to be a god. Jesus' resurrection poured cold water on this mythical belief. Those who realized his resurrection recognized the folly of those who had rejoiced at the death of an innocent man. They began declaring that folly as Christians do today. Jesus thus exposed the myth that people had lived by, that witches really are guilty, so deserve to be or must be killed. Thus, faith in Jesus undermines envy in the scriptures in general and witchcraft. Any difference between levels of envy and witchcraft between the West and Africa arise from the depth of the hold of the gospel of Jesus on people and the convictions passed on between generations by Christ's devoted followers. It is not man's doing, but God's. That's a key part there of the presentation in a way. Life post-Jesus. Jesus' achievement has, in the course of time, enabled a major reduction in the horrors of envy amongst Western people. A movement away from human spiritual causation of misfortune has been a part of the enabling of perception of physical causation, trying to find an origin of Western rationality or whatever. So witchcraft can, through its belief in the agency of envy and other folk forces, significantly reduce physical violence between people. A reduction in fear of witchcraft can raise levels of violence. I assume people are familiar with that. If not, you can ask in due course. It is important to consider the difference between the role of a Christian pastor and that of a sangoma, as South Africans, I think, use that term. The sangoma solves problems by shedding blood of people or animals. A Christian pastor draws on the shed blood of Christ. I learned about the centrality of the death and resurrection of Christ from Israel churches in Kenya. I think one of those churches illustrated was an Israel church. I'm not actually sure, but they're one of the, let's say, Zionist-type churches we have in Kenya. Quite large, in other words, many branches, and meet on Fridays as well as Sundays. I very rarely attend on a Sunday, but a Friday they're there a number of hours, and the focus of their meeting is at noon when they read 2 or 3 accounts of the crucifixion of Christ from the Gospels. Someone then expounds on that again every Friday, which kind of makes one think of the Mass that is frequently celebrated, of course, in Catholic churches and Orthodox churches for that matter. So the New Testament's focus on the death and resurrection of Christ is clear from the conversion of the Gospels on this event. It's also made clear by Paul in his letter to the Christians in Corinth. So 1 Corinthians 1:20-25, where is a wise person? Where is a teacher of the law? Where is a philosopher of this age. Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. The cross seems to be folly. In other words, Jews demand signs, Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. So Paul there, now of course the other way around, confirming Girard's focus on the cross as highly legitimate in terms of Christian theology. So the how of mission work and antidote to envy and witchcraft. While there are benefits to imitating Western articulations of the gospel, including the languages in which it is engaged, this practice has its drawbacks. One that should be clear from the above, it puts African people into a position of competing for the set of resources being used by Westerners instead of into producing their own. One can expand on every point here. This is the consistency with which that has happened across a vast continent is incredible. Everywhere following the foreign rather than innovating one's own. And this is not really being explored because it's a taboo area. More specifically, imitating the discourse of people at a different stage of adoption of the gospel of Jesus in their communities can easily result in that adoption not enabling the filling of the gap needed to reach that stage. In other words, use of English is oriented to resolving issues as perceived by the USA, not as extant in Africa. Hence the important need for use of indigenous languages in African theology. More Western missionaries ought to carry out their ministry in Africa using African languages. Now we discussed some of this already when landed in, I've forgotten my colleague's office. The discourse that is welcomed in Africa is one that's already being engaged by other people, and it presupposes things that seem not to be there. So this seems to be a very serious undermining of sense that is going on constantly and not really being pointed to for reasons of, let's say, taboo. I have in this article drawn on the work of René Girard, a scholar whose theory seems to be particularly helpful in revealing what is happening in Africa today, to explain how it is faith in the gospel of Jesus that enables people to overcome envy and witchcraft. So there's my final slide. Any difference, this is a repeat actually, between levels of envy and witchcraft between the West and Africa arise from the depth of hold of the gospel of Jesus on people, and the convictions passed on between generations by Christ's devoted followers. It's not man's doing, but God's. Now, no sign of the time having reached. So, how do I know this? Well, Girard, when I read him, confirmed the things that I was seeing in people's determined adherence to the gospel in many parts of Africa. It's not only where I'm coming from, where you have churches every 2 blocks, they say, or every few hundred yards down every road. People are being helped and have caught on to this assistance, which is not being articulated in the scholarly world because it wasn't, I suppose, supposed to happen. So let me stop there and open for discussion or whatever.
Thank you. Just before we start the questions, it might be helpful to explain which church you were trained in and which mission, therefore which theology you are expanding here.
Okay. My home church in England is Baptist Union. My theological training came from All Nations Christian College, Evangelical, and London School of Theology it is now. And then my PhD was in University of Birmingham. Although PhD, as you know, in UK it's entirely research. In Kenya, my home church is basically a Pentecostal church. I work a lot with the indigenous churches also, the Roho churches, and I'm affiliated to the Coptic Orthodox. I seem to go across the board somewhat. I like Reformed tradition. I don't see getting much traction in the places in Africa I know.
Okay.
In what language does the liturgy at the Coptic Church take place?
The Coptic Church in Egypt operates primarily in Arabic, and then they also have the Coptic language, which the monks learn, and to different degrees the Egyptian Christians know and use in parts of their liturgy.
And at the specific church in Kenya, do they also use Arabic?
Yeah, we have a mixture of things. We don't at the moment have a priest from Egypt. So our priests will tend to use English for the Egyptians. But if there is a priest available, then they'll have something for the Egyptians, often in Arabic. Now, I'm often left to do the Swahili for the Kenyans and Tanzanians. That's kind of how it works out. Obviously I don't do the liturgy, but when it comes to Bible study or whatever.
Yeah. Are there plenty of Kenyan converts in the Coptic churches? Does it mainly cater to like an Egyptian community in Kenya?
Kenyans.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, they say there's 40 branches. In Kenya, hospitals is a big business. Maybe there's a big hospital in Nairobi, Coptic Church. That's what they're perhaps most well known for.
Just to also invite the people online to participate if you wish.
Yes, we could also, any questions online, please raise your hand and we'll get to you. So, Jim, you raced through 2,000 years of history and kind of crossed over from anthropology and Freudian anthropology, if we look at Girard's sort of like basis of accepting these Freudian style myths about primal horde and claims about violence as internal to human society. And therefore that is why sacrifice is required, because of the internal aggression in human society. Then sacrifice becomes the outlook whereby you dissipate some of that violence. So it becomes a necessary form, because Girard has already taken for granted that aggression is just internal to humans. Basically, early anthropology, early sociology, they literally have a very primitive understanding of what human beings are, based on almost no research, based on kind of the mythical understanding and a lot of Freudian myths going into this. And then from there, it seems like you may be confirming your prejudices to pick up Girard and go, yeah, this is going on in churches in Kenya, because I can see it. So it would be useful to kind of explain that link in kind of more detail, because as you know, Girard obviously isn't the only thinker on violence, but there's also seemed to be a very quick switch between like Christian supersessionist understanding of Christ-solved soul Judaism, and then how that was then seen as witchcraft. The link to witchcraft was almost immediate, and as far as I understand, the claims weren't exactly the type of witchcraft that you might find in East Africa. So those links seem to me kind of like very problematic if you're kind of like trying to look through your thesis. Gerard confirming a kind of a primitive myth, Freudian primitive myth, how that's linked into Christianity, the quick link from Jesus solving Judaism and looking somehow at sacrifice in Judaism very briefly, and then jump forward 2,000 years into your research into witchcraft. Could you unpack some of those steps a little so we can understand how you construct this theory a bit better?
I will endeavour to do so. Whether I'll satisfy everyone here, I don't know. I am essentially a field missionary, but one who's done a lot of reading and writing in order to try and educate others, because it seems to be very rare these days to have someone who commits themselves long term to one, say, African community and can get any in-depth exposure to what's going on. So my conviction from the beginning, or yeah, as I say, even before I left for Africa, but certainly from being in Zambia, that I should do that, and again, by God's grace, I've been able to do it. So then it's a question of how to articulate that in a way that folks can understand. Girard I was pointed to him by a Christian anthropologist, and it made sense. I perceived that what he was saying could explain the gaps that I hadn't been able to explain to date. Now, that is not to say that my colleagues in these churches latch onto that and say, yes, Jim, you're absolutely on the ball. And it seems like the link between the cross of Christ rendering what we might call, okay, it's called the altar in the church, at the front of the church where the priest stands, if you like, into a place of killing. And that is what then attracts the people to the church, because you don't have churches without crosses. Well, if you have a church without a cross, it becomes something different. The Christian church celebrates the death of Christ. But if you look into the community, and this is something I've asked folks a few times, so if I said to you that a certain person really loves his children, what are you going to do? Well, I don't know. But if I say a certain person has killed his children, what will you do? Well, they go there straight away. They go to where this person is. There's also the love that people have for gathering. I guess that's a universal to humankind. We like to be together. But being together is difficult because we tend not to agree with one another, and conversation can get negative. So what I'm seeing in these Christian gatherings, the nature of the scriptures is such that people gather together without having to identify a victim. And looking back into, say, the Luo tradition, for example, we had this thing called Diro. Of course, in pre-colonial times, there was no Sundays. We had Diro, which people did when there was a problem to be solved, like the crops were failing, or the cows were sick, or the enemies were threatening. And okay, the enemies threatening is a slightly different example. If I go to the other two, people would gather together with what purpose? Finding a victim. And gathering with the purpose of finding the victim is a bit of a frightening thing to be doing, because, well, it might be me, it might be so-and-so. So the possibility of getting together and engaging in an uplifting discourse without having to victimize is part of the revolution that the gospel is bringing in the context that I'm seeing. Now, does that answer your question?
Yeah, some of it, because what I gather is you're saying that the gap you're trying to figure out is why people are attracted to a church and why they come together in one sense, and then secondly, once you've filled those steps, why they come together without killing people. But then in that picture, it seems like then the cross signals a space of crime and violence, which is the altar, because altars are originally sacrificial. You know, you kill things on an altar. You see an altar, go, oh, there's going to be killing, great. And then you come in, and then it's confusing because there isn't killing. And there's biblical discussion, for example. But the other thing is, people gather for a reason to find a victim is a very Girardian moment thrown into a Christian theology of peace. It seems like a kind of bringing out the anthropological violence into what other theologians might want to describe more peacefully, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, in many cases one reads between the lines, and it's a subjective process, as qualitative research always is. In the conversations, in attending gathering after gathering after gathering, and seeing people enjoy the gathering, value the gathering, and realizing that without the scriptures, without the Bible, how could you do it? Because it would result in, of course, there are tensions in churches, of course, I mean, but there's a reduced level of of tension there.
Sure, go ahead.
You want to go first?
No, you go.
Well, thank you. So I just want to take us from psychology to understanding desire and then conflict in this psychological dimension of we desire what other people desire and they reflect desire, then we kill each other, to go out a little bit to see anthropology and sociology and to focus on the notion of a tradition. So we here are visiting a locality where there are two traditions, the Christianity and the African,